Though Cyberpunk has been out for a few years, it's still highly regarded as one of the most popular games of its time, which has seemingly got better as time has gone on through updates and patches, with the latest adding in Ray Tracing Overdrive mode. So we thought we'd put it to the test to see how it performs on every 40 series and 30 series GPU that's been released from NVIDIA. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So as you can see, I have a ton of GPUs here, and I will explain why shortly. So you may have seen that Cyberpunk now has a new update through way of the 1.62 patch, which now gives us the next level of ray tracing called Overdrive, which now brings us path tracing, a technology that brings the very best visuals in a game, unlike anything we've seen before. And CD Projekt Red have even been as bold to call it a technology preview, as they are more than aware that it may not be the perfect outcome from the start. I mean, they are pretty, known for their bugs, shall we say. This also paves the way for other games to utilise the technology, but will come at a cost, that being the need for the very latest GPU to be able to harness the potential, while also running fluidly. It's recommended that you own a 4070 Ti or higher, or if wanting to run at 1080p, a 3090 or 3090 Ti. Likely due to the sheer brute power and higher memory capacity that they both have. For those with lower end RTX capable hardware, they have made a path traced screenshot mode, but we just went all in and tested a total of 14 RTX based GPUs. So everything from the RTX 3050 all the way up to the beastly RTX 4090. Knowing that the lower end cards may completely fall over when enabled, luckily the game does also support the latest NVIDIA upscaling technology, DLSS 3 with frame generation, which should give us some frames back that may be lost through enabling overdrive, allowing us to show exactly how each card performs on a variety of settings. To test, we booted up our GPU test system consisting of an Intel Core i9 12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard with 32GB of Patriot Viper 6200MHz memory. We tested all of the cards on Windows 11 21H2 with NVIDIA's GeForce 531.42 driver. We ran the game on all 14 GPUs using the Ultra preset, while when enabling ray tracing, we used the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. For Overdrive, it has its own preset called Ray Tracing Overdrive, and we'll be comparing all of them to each other today. So let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with the RTX 3050, which at 1080p we were seeing figures around the 52 FPS mark in the averages, which enabling ray tracing saw performance take a hit of 59%. Luckily, DLSS in performance mode saw performance increase almost back to the levels we saw with no ray tracing, while enabling overdrive saw performance drop to 25 FPS, a 51% decrease from running the game with just pure rasterization. 1440p was still playable to a degree with either no ray tracing or with DLSS performance mode on, while overdrive dropped to less than 20 FPS, making it somewhat unplayable. And then 4K was frankly laughable and unplayable no matter the settings that we tested on. The RTX 3060 saw slightly better performance as expected, and at 1080p, ray tracing with DLSS in performance mode garnered better results than just running on vanilla settings, coming in at 70 FPS. With ray tracing turned on, we took a hit as expected, though overdrive with DLSS did come in higher at 32 FPS, making it still playable. You may notice some glitches here and there due to the 1% lows dipping down to 15 FPS, but it's not bad overall. Again, while 1440p is a better story than 4K and is still playable to a degree, 4K is completely out of the question and you'd be better off sticking to 1080p with this GPU. The RTX 3060 Ti at 1080 and 1440 come in with some pretty respectable numbers at 90 FPS and 57 FPS respectively, with ray tracing and DLSS performance clawing back some performance from just having ray tracing enabled on its own. RT Overdrive was actually pretty good at 1080p, coming in at 49 FPS, while at 1440p we saw a 34% hit in comparison, though for someone who used to stream this game at a locked 30 FPS, it's still more than playable. Again, 4K isn't really worth entertaining, unless you are playing with DLSS enabled without overdrive. The RTX 3070 with overdrive enabled showed some really strong performance at 1080p, just slightly missing the magical mark of 60 FPS. While I'd advise 1440p gamers to ditch overdrive in favour of just running with ray tracing and DLSS in performance mode enabled instead. It's here that you'll gain around 86% in performance while sacrificing nicer visuals. Then, without sounding like a broken record, while 4K with DLSS in performance mode without overdrive is possible, it's unlikely that you'd be gaming at 4K with an RTX 3070 in this game anyway. Moving up to the 3070 Ti, and we're now in the realms of perfectly playable frame rates when using overdrive at 1080p, coming in at 60 FPS on average with 1% lows of 46 FPS. This is a drop in performance of 44% when compared to no ray tracing, and 36% going from ray tracing with DLSS set to performance mode. 1440p would likely see you gaming without overdrive and instead with just plain old, yet still beautiful, ray tracing enabled with DLSS. While 4K is still just a bit too far out of reach for what would be considered comfortable. Though at 39 FPS with DLSS enabled, it's not bad at all. So moving up to the 3080 10GB, and we are now starting to see some pretty big numbers at 1080p. For those playing Cyberpunk with this GPU, you'd be stupid not to enable ray tracing, as you only see a drop in performance of around 17%, while enabling overdrive sees another hit of 33%, but still a respectable 74 FPS. 1440p sees overdrive coming in at 51 FPS, which is a little lower than that magical 60 FPS threshold that gamers crave, and may again be better suited to just running with ray tracing and DLSS enabled instead. 4K is now up to almost comfortable levels with ray tracing and DLSS enabled, but overdrive is still at pretty low levels that wouldn't be enjoyable. The 3080 12GB improves on that slightly, now seeing 8% more performance at 1080p with overdrive enabled, and around the same at 1440p, though it's very much the same story as the 10GB with 1080p being perfect for overdrive, while 1440p is still just a smidge below where I'd personally want it if wanting to run overdrive. 4K shows strong performance using ray tracing and DLSS, but is still miles away from where you'd want it to be when utilising overdrive. The 3080 Ti actually saw worse performance than the 3080 12GB at 1080 with overdrive enabled, and very similar performance on the other presets. It saw higher performance by a small margin between 4 and 7% at 1440p, and shows that overdrive is now pretty viable, while 4K also hits 60 FPS in the averages using the ray tracing and DLSS settings, and now also seeing overdrive hitting 30 FPS, making it more than playable. So moving up to the big boys and the RTX 3090, which doesn't actually give us any extra performance in overdrive at any of the three resolutions. Instead, we see performance pretty much matching the 3080 Ti or dropping slightly by a few frames per second. So my comments before stand for this card too, and there's not much else to say about it in all honesty. The RTX 3090 Ti improves on that slightly with some pretty strong figures for overdrive at both 1080p and 1440p, though those wanting to play at 4K will still barely be coming in over 30 FPS with overdrive enabled, and instead you'll be better off with bog standard ray tracing with DLSS set to performance mode instead, coming in with a healthy 66 FPS in terms of performance. So now things start to get interesting, because as we move up to the 40 series, we also get the ability to enable DLSS 3 with and without overdrive. So we should start to see some pretty amazing performance even on lower end cards. So kicking things off with the RTX 4070, and it's here at 1080p that we start to see the true potential of the Ada Lovelace architecture even on standard settings. Enabling overdrive with DLSS still sees strong performance at 80 FPS, while DLSS 3 takes it into a whole different realm at 131 FPS, pushing 5% more frames than the 3090 Ti with no ray tracing enabled. 1440p also sees its strongest performance with ray tracing and DLSS 3 enabled, while overdrive with DLSS 3 still makes it a viable option, coming in at 86 frames per second. 4K sees numbers a bit on the low side, though ray tracing with DLSS 3 still manages to pack a punch at 71 FPS, while enabling overdrive with DLSS 3 sees a 40% performance hit, now packing 42 FPS. The 4070 Ti improves on this quite dramatically at 1080p with a 21% boost in performance when comparing overdrive with DLSS 3 across the 4070 and 4070 Ti, giving us 159 FPS in the averages and a still strong 117 FPS in the 1% lows. 1440p carries on this trend with Overdrive coming in at 110 FPS, a nice and cool 27% uplift from the RTX 4070, and it's now where we see at 4K the 4070 Ti getting closer to that 60 FPS number that gamers aim for, though ray tracing with DLSS 3 is probably the safer bet at 90 FPS average. The RTX 4080 at 1080p came in with numbers across all settings that would be comfortable to play, with the big standout number being 177 FPS using Overdrive with DLSS 3. Though even with normal DLSS, you're getting some strong performance at 106 FPS. While 1440p gave the most interesting numbers because the 1% lows were virtually non-existent, separated by just 7 frames between it, and the average when using Overdrive. 4K is likely where you'll want to be playing though, with an average of 69 FPS. Ladies, meaning that you'll get the very best visuals while also getting some pretty stellar performance at the same time. Then finally, taking a look at the RTX 4090, no matter what resolution you game at, you're going to be getting some pretty big numbers, with Overdrive coupled with DLSS 3 giving us 23% more performance compared to running the game in pure rasterization mode. You'd be foolish to not turn Overdrive with DLSS 3 on and enjoy how beautifully stunning the game is, all while getting close to 100 frames per second. So some pretty stark differences between the various presets, and actually some surprisingly strong performance. I mean, I remember when Cyberpunk first came out, and having ray tracing and not much else really saw performance tank. While now the likes of DLSS and more importantly DLSS 3 with frame generation has really seen it harness some extra performance back. Enabling Overdrive was always going to take a further hit, but again, DLSS and more importantly DLSS 3 has really seen it kind of come into its own, even at higher resolutions. Now obviously if you're wanting to use it and game at 4K, then you're going to want an RTX 4080 or above. Though performance on the 4070 Ti at 4K with Overdrive and DLSS 3 wasn't exactly bad at 54 FPS, and I honestly think some refinements and driver updates could actually see that step past that 60 FPS yardstick. The beauty of Cyberpunk, other than the visuals, is that you can play it at a lower frame rate, and 30 FPS is perfectly comfortable. But as enthusiasts, we all want more, right? But I also get that not everyone is sold on DLSS, especially considering how grainy it used to make games, especially at higher resolutions. But in terms of the performance hit that it takes, it can be quite sizable. I mean, looking at how rasterization compares to Overdrive, which sets DLSS to auto at 1080p, and it's clear to see those drops in performance, which in some cases is anywhere up to 52%. Though on the 40 series, that gap does narrow ever so slightly, and the 1% lows get much stronger too. When comparing how ray tracing is against RT Overdrive with DLSS, again it's clear to see that at the lower resolution, the high-end 40 series cards chew it up, though most of the higher-end 30 series cards came in with similar results in ray tracing, likely a bottleneck of some kind that DLSS would solve. Then when comparing Overdrive enabled with both DLSS and DLSS 3, there's a performance gain upwards of around 91% in some cases, giving amazing visuals and performance to match. Then looking at DLSS 3 in general, there isn't as much of a performance hit when enabling Overdrive as I thought there would be, especially on the RTX 4090. All cards hit well in excess of 100 FPS, but how do things do at higher resolutions? Well, at 1440p with no ray tracing compared to Overdrive, we did see an outlier with the RTX 3090, which seemed to suffer for some reason with Overdrive enabled, likely due to throttling on the memory due to the bad design in placing it on the rear of the card. While everything from the 4070 Ti up and a couple of the 30 series did extremely well, and is a trade-off between visuals and performance. Again, looking at how ray tracing compares to Overdrive, and a lot of the cards performed very similar to each other, with the only breakthroughs really being the RTX 4080 and 4090, with only the flagship hitting beyond 60 FPS. Again, we do see a large uptake in performance when enabling DLSS 3 with Overdrive, and in some cases of around 60%, and some strong numbers across all of the 40 series, though the 4070 does fall just below that 60 FPS benchmark now with standard DLSS, while DLSS 3 propels it forward by 65%. Then looking at ray tracing versus Overdrive, both with DLSS 3 enabled, and again, strong numbers all around. And though performance drops anywhere up to 34%, the performance is still really strong. Then finally looking at those all-important 4K numbers, and with Overdrive enabled, the RTX 4090 is the only card that peaks past 60 FPS. So at this resolution, it's pretty clear that DLSS 3 is going to be needed if you want those fancy visuals. That's evident to see even without Overdrive, where enabling ray tracing just sees performance drop by around 30% on all cards, with some just frankly being unplayable on the lower end. You could argue that the 3080 Ti, 3090 Ti and the 4070 Ti and up is playable, but it wouldn't be the most fluid gameplay, though DLSS 3 again should fix that. That's again clear to us when comparing Overdrive in both DLSS technologies, where we see around a 60% uplift in performance after enabling DLSS 3 compared to DLSS, giving strong numbers, especially on the 4080 and 4090 that fly past the 60 FPS marker. Lastly, looking at ray tracing with DLSS 3 and Overdrive with DLSS 3, and if you're not bothered about the very best visuals, you can get a pretty decent bump in performance with just standard ray tracing, which, don't get me wrong, still looks great, but doesn't shine quite like Overdrive does. So a lot of data we've gone through, but I'm actually not done, as there's still the visual aspect of playing the game. Performance is one thing, but what about how things actually look? Well, looking at pure rasterization compared to ray tracing enabled and then overdrive enabled, we went through a few parts of the game to see how the presets actually make a difference in terms of the visuals. It's here that we see Ray Tracing Ultra and Overdrive both significantly improving the reflections on glass, like the car's window for example. The reflections on Ultra settings were already impressive, but Ray Tracing and Overdrive just improved them, along with Overdrive making coloured lights blend more, though it does have more trailing issues similar to kind of what you'd expect from ghosting, but a little bit more unique. In our next clip with Ray Tracing and Overdrive, minor shadows have seen an improvement, while shadows are darker and more contrasted. Though in Overdrive, shadows are also slightly softer. Though a trade-off means that, as we can see from the truck, the shadow does look somewhat fuzzier, but that's actually what you'd expect from a realistic shadow anyway. In our next clip with no ray tracing, we can see the reflection on the stairlight isn't displaying how you'd expect it to, while with ray tracing, the whole scene is more contrasted and less washed out in general. The reflection on the red sign that says cab isn't representative of the actual sign with no ray tracing enabled, while enabling ray tracing or overdrive suddenly changes the reflection to be a true representation of the sign. Again, shadows are softer in overdrive, but in a good way because it gives the sense of being more realistic overall. The next clip shows that reflections of signs are just, well, static colours with no ray tracing, while when enabled the reflections act more like a light source, lighting up the ceiling. Overdrive made the whole scene significantly darker by eliminating artificial natural light and affected the lighting of the whole scene in a way that's a truer representation of how it would look in real life, especially if you were actually inside a tunnel. Lastly, in this scene we can see that with no ray tracing, the bridge reflections on Ultra are passable but completely wrong and unrealistic. Turning on ray tracing, there is an immediate difference in the glass which is now actually reflecting the world around it, similar to what you'd expect to see in real life. Though Overdrive takes it one step further, and while the reflections haven't changed, the way that the materials catch the light has, and leads to a kind of subtle effect that sees it bouncing upwards onto the underside of the bridge and then diffusing as it hits the floor on the way back down. So in terms of summing up the visuals, Ultra still looks really good, but it's just missing that realism factor that you'd want in a game like this. In terms of the reflections, they are almost static or flat in the scenes that we looked at, though still look absolutely amazing, until you turn on ray tracing, where it adds that extra sense of realism by reflecting the world and making big changes to the way that things are lit. Overdrive takes it one step beyond that and makes lighting just feel more realistic by almost blending it all together better, with softer shadows for example, which, while some may argue look a bit odd, it's the truest representation of how we see things in the real world. It's just something that you won't be used to seeing in a game for the very first time. It also tends to make the scenes darker, a bit like when you enable HDR, but again adding that realism where you're not getting a form of artificial light coming into the scene that just simply isn't there, again making it similar to real life. Also, throughout all of our testing, we did look at the visual quality, something that I've complained about in the past due to DLSS adding graininess or blurring things slightly. But seemingly, to a degree, that's now all gone and is unnoticeable at 4K on a big screen from a reasonable distance away. Whatever the setting you go for, it's going to look beautiful. And while ray tracing improves on that, Overdrive just takes it to another level. Though with DLSS 3, it does add trailing, which could be a consequence of latency being increased due to the way that the technology actually works. But that's why NVIDIA implemented Reflex to combat it. So it could, in theory, get better over time as things mature and more updates come out and drivers kind of fix things and all that kind of good stuff. So there you have it, a big video for a big game, and more importantly, a big feature that has been implemented into it. Is this the start of next level gaming, and more importantly, can AMD and Intel do anything to match it, or even beat what NVIDIA are doing? Probably not likely. I think it's safe to say though that more games will implement Overdrive, and I think it's also safe to say that while the 30 series are capable of running Overdrive, at least at lower resolutions, the 40 series makes it look effortless. That about wraps up this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And also let me know in the comments section below, what GPU are you rocking right now? And have you tried Cyberpunk with Overdrive yet? And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you get access to tons of exclusive benefits, including behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, a super special area on our Discord, access to our testing data, and much, much more. The link for all that great stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.